Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Syria's foreign minister has denied the government carried out a chemical attack on the rebel-held town of Idlib. More than 70 people, including many children, are reported to have died in the airstrike on Tuesday. Turkey says the results of post-mortem examinations carried out on the victims confirm chemical weapons were used and has blamed President Assad's forces. Our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins reports.
The international investigation is underway. Some victims of Tuesday's mass poisoning are now being treated in Turkish hospitals. Samples taken from them, as well as post-mortem examinations of 3 people who died in Turkey, have left the government there, long-time opponents of President Assad, in no doubt.
Unfortunately, it is very clear to us that the Assad regime has no hesitation in using chemical weapons. They attacked with chemical weapons.
The war in Syria is now in its 7th year. The first forensic medical results from this latest outrage cannot on their own prove who is to blame. But crucially, a series of post-mortems in Turkey were apparently attended by international experts from both the World Health Organization and the OPCW, the UN's organization for the prohibition of chemical weapons. In the tests, 3 bodies were examined and they were found to be victims of a chemical agent. The Turkish Health Ministry says it was the nerve agent sarin. It's partly for that reason that Turkey insists President Assad was responsible. In Idlib, a local lawyer says he's been collecting samples he hopes can be submitted to an international investigation. But such samples gathered without adequate supervision seem unlikely to be regarded as reliable. And the Syrian government today flatly denied any responsibility.
Our army has never used chemical weapons and will not use chemical weapons, not only against our civilians or our people, but also against the terrorists.
Not for the first time, America and her allies don't believe a word of Syrian denials. Crucial now will be what, if anything, the United States decides to do in response.
Well, there's no doubt in our mind that the Syrian regime under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad is responsible for this horrific attack. And we think it's time that the Russians really need to think carefully about their continued support of the Assad regime.
And the Secretary of State will be in Moscow next week pressing that case. But at the United Nations, Russia has already rounded on its critics, made clear it's sticking with President Assad and blamed opposition forces for the chemical attack. Deadlock and the war continue. James Robbins, BBC News.
Well, as James mentioned there, Donald Trump's response to the suspected Syrian chemical attack will be key. Earlier, his administration said that military action against Syria is not off the table. Meanwhile, Mr. Trump is preparing to meet later today the leader of the world's other economic superpower, President Xi Jinping of China. The agenda for the talks will focus on 2 areas. Trade will feature heavily, as the US and China have perhaps the world's most important trade relationship, but discussions could be fractious. The other hot topic of conversation will be North Korea's nuclear program, with President Trump demanding Beijing does more to rein in its reclusive neighbour. For both these reasons, Mr. Trump says he believes the summit in Florida will be very difficult. Well, let's speak to our North America editor, John Sobel, who's in Florida with the president. So, John, what are both men hoping to get out of this summit?
Well, Fiona, make no mistake about it. This is the most consequential meeting that President Trump has held since he took office. These are 2 leaders, both of whom you could describe as populists, both of whom you could describe as projecting a tough guy image, both of whom you could describe as nationalists. So both men will want to come away with something at the end of their meetings together. Now, it's also worth saying that the trade issue is very, very difficult indeed. But there may be some kind of agreement where China promises to invest in the US economy in Donald Trump's infrastructure plan in return for the US president saying, you know what, we won't go ahead with our threat of tariffs or declaring you a currency manipulator, both of which could have very serious consequences for world trade. If President Xi can go back to Beijing with that, he might consider that a victory. If Donald Trump gets a commitment of increased inward investment in the US from China, well, that could be seen as something of a victory. North Korea is very, very difficult. Donald Trump believes that only Beijing are the people that can exercise real leverage over the North Korean rulers. And so they will want to see China taking a tougher stance on North Korea. And maybe there is a quid pro quo there as well, that the US has less to say about Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea in return for China taking a tougher stand on North Korea. But these are difficult, thorny issues. Mar-a-Lago behind me is meant to be a place where you go for relaxation. There won't be much relaxation over the next 24 hours.
No. John, thank you very much.
He lost 25 members of his family, his wife, his 9-month-old twins. Pictures of Syrian shopkeeper Abdul Hamid al-Youssef carrying their bodies have been shared around the world, a symbol of the horror of the suspected chemical attack in Idlib. Today he talked of criminal planes which dropped poison from the skies. So far, at least 86 people have died and hundreds more have been injured. And in the United States, there are growing indications tonight that President Trump is now considering a military response. Here's our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum. A warning, her report does contain upsetting scenes from the very beginning.
I want to see my children, he says. Take me to them. What comfort can his friends give? For his children are not in the hospital. They're not getting treatment in Turkey. They're gone forever. His beautiful 9-month-old twins, Aya and Ahmad, who died without a scar on their bodies, their breath stopped by poison gas. Abdul al-Hamid al-Youssef, 29 years old, who can't be the father nor the husband he dreamed he'd be. His wife died with his children and his brother and some 20 other relatives. He wanted local activists to film him so the world can see how chemical weapons destroyed his family. The graveyard in Khan Sheikhoun was dug quickly. They're still digging because people are still dying, slowly succumbing to the effects of what autopsies in Turkey say was the nerve agent sarin. Everyone in the area knows that Western governments have condemned the attack, and they expect no more than words.
Victory will come from God, but you're doing nothing. It's been 6 years. What more do you want from us? What about the children? My children fell before my eyes. No one could help them. How can this be right or fair? Shame on you. Fear God and think of us. May God punish them.
This was a foul thing to do, a foul crime, absolutely no question. This was an abominable and contemptible thing to do to innocent people. And those who did it deserve international condemnation first of all. And we need to get to the bottom of what has happened.
But what to do about it? The Russians will veto a UN Security Council resolution, and the British and French are alarmed at the suddenly belligerent tone in Washington.
I repeat, the first stage is to get a resolution vote, and above all, to restart peace negotiations in Geneva. It's not to go in ourselves and get onto a war footing on account of the US president having had a rush of blood to the head.
As for the Syrian government, they deny all responsibility and, backed by the Russians, are trying to stave off any independent investigation.
We will not accept any investigative committee. We have to guarantee it won't be politicised, that it represents wide geographic presence, and it must leave from Damascus and not from Turkey. We have numerous questions. When we're certain these questions are answered convincingly, we'll give you our response.
Today, Syrian government, or maybe Russian aircraft, were attacking south of the town hit by chemical weapons on Tuesday. It's an area controlled by jihadi groups. The UN has called for a 72-hour ceasefire to save civilians, but neither government nor rebel groups are in the mood for peace.
Lindsay Hilson reporting there. Well, in the last few minutes, reports from Washington say that the Pentagon is having detailed discussions with the White House about military options in Syria. Let's go live now to our Washington correspondent, Kylie Morris. What are these options?
Well, the options are currently being scrambled and put together by the Pentagon. The challenge is, I think, that the Pentagon had been looking in the direction of the Islamic State group. They'd been tasked with drawing up a blueprint to present to President Trump. He'd promised a new plan for the American people within 30 days of his election. And yet here they are now being required to look at options that might include, for example, striking airfields that were used in that chemical attack, or perhaps trying to damage the capability of Bashar al-Assad's air force. But this is really a sudden change. It's a 180-degree turnabout from President Trump. Only last week, his key people were saying it is no longer our focus in Syria to remove Bashar al-Assad. Instead, we're purely looking at how to defeat and destroy the Islamic State group. Now, clearly, President Trump, he's made some calls to Capitol Hill. He did that after the press conference yesterday. We know he's spoken to a number of congressmen. He's told them he is definitely considering military action. He'll be taking advice from his Defense Secretary General Mattis. He's on his way. He's already gone down to Mar-a-Lago in Florida to meet with President Xi. And we know that there, the Defense Secretary will be meeting with him, and it's very likely that that's where these discussions will take place. It's important, though, to remember, I think, that no final decision has been taken at this stage to carry out military action. The plans, though, are on the table.
Kylie, thank you very much indeed. Well, joining me now from central London is Karen von Hippel, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the US State Department and Director of the Foreign Policy think tank, the Royal United Services Institute. And from Abu Dhabi, the US diplomat Ali Kaderi, who was a special assistant to 5 American ambassadors in Iraq, formerly supported President Obama, and now informally advises the Trump administration on foreign affairs. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Ali Kaderi. You heard Kylie Morris there, perhaps, that, I mean, the president is planning something. You informally advise his administration. What is he actually planning at the moment, as far as you know?
Well, I'm sure those plans are highly classified, and so I don't know the details. But what I would advise the administration to do is to respond proportionally in a calculated manner to this horrendous crime against humanity and war crime. So rather than, for example, an all-out offensive to decapitate the Assad regime or bring about regime change, one option on the table would be to strike the jet aircraft or the helicopters or the runways or maintenance facilities or fuel depots or command and control organizations or individuals that were involved in this war crime. And that way what you can do is you can lay down a marker for President Assad that, unlike in the Obama administration, these war crimes will not be allowed to continue. And this, what this also does, very importantly, early on in the Trump administration, is it sets a marker down for other rogue states, including the Iranians and their Revolutionary Guards, Lebanese Hezbollah, the North Korean regime, the Russians, and others around the world who choose to test the resolve of the United States of America.
I mean, it is amazing that we're even having this discussion about Donald Trump doing something militarily in Syria, because until a few days ago, he seemed to have no intention at all of going in there militarily. He's also talked, of course, about North Korea, and he's talked about Iran, as he mentioned. At some stage, he's going to have to do something to be as good as his word.
That's correct. And so during his press conference yesterday with His Majesty King Abdullah of Jordan at the Rose Garden, he was asked about what he thought of this war crime, and he said that it surpassed not only a personal red line of his, but many, many lines. And so having said those words, as we learned with President Obama, the word of the President of the United States is vitally important. So you must follow those words with actions, otherwise rogue actors, whether state actors or non-state actors, will defy the United States. And it's very imperative, after the last 8 years of, generally speaking, a failed foreign policy in the Middle East by President Obama, it's very important that the United States regain credibility and, again, set down a marker that these violations of international norms and international law will not be tolerated by the international community, led by the United States as the world's only superpower.
Karen von Hippel, I'm sure you just heard that there. What's your reaction to that? Every president is a reaction to the previous president, and now that's what we're about to see from Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating because as a candidate, he actually tweeted against Obama taking military action after the red lines were crossed. And now he's actually basically agreeing that the red line has been crossed and he wants to do something about it. I agree with the previous speaker. I think it's very important early on for Trump to demonstrate that his words mean something. And of all the foreign policy challenges, in a sense, this one makes the most sense in terms of a targeted surgical military strike. Agree that they should not go all-out war, and I don't think that would be anyway on the agenda. I imagine they want to make it hurt so that they can bring them back to the negotiating table.
So here we are talking about surgical military strikes, but we're dealing with military strikes potentially against the Assad regime, supported by Donald Trump's best buddies in Moscow. I mean, this is potentially really risky, isn't it?
It is risky, and that's exactly the challenge, is to make sure that whatever happens, that they stay away from attacking any Russian military assets, and also that the Russians don't try to shoot down any American jets. Now, I suspect that wouldn't happen, but yes, it's very complicated, and it has to be done very carefully. You know, I have a lot of respect for General Mattis, and he has a lot of experience, and so I think whatever he does advise and carry out, it will be done with the utmost caution.
Right. Ali Kaderi, if I can ask you a final question. With all the talk that we're hearing at the moment, and I guess that President Trump, when he's hosting President Xi Jinping of China in Mar-a-Lago later today, between rounds of golf, he'll be talking military action, which, you know, is quite impressive for his guest. Do you really think that in a week from now, or perhaps even sooner, we might see American jets hitting Assad targets in Syria? Do you think that is going to happen?
I believe the White House has already told the media that there will not be rounds of golf, that the president will be very busy otherwise this weekend. But I do understand that Secretary Mattis, whom I worked for at Central Command, is flying down to brief the president, presumably with other members of the national security team. And I also understand that Secretary Tillerson is on his way to Moscow to engage with previous contacts of his, including Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and President Putin. I don't believe that American jets will be flying over Syria because the Syrian air defense system, the Russian air defense systems, which include very advanced S-400 and S-300 air defense systems. I believe that one of the probably the most prudent strike options is rather to use Tomahawk cruise missiles, again, in a very surgical manner, having frankly told other regional actors and global powers that this is going to happen. So the United States is most likely going to inform other members of the permanent members of the Security Council, United Kingdom, France, its EU and NATO allies, and I believe the Russians and Chinese, that, look, this is not an all-out assault, but 500,000 Syrians have been killed, 1 million wounded, and half the population have been displaced, and it must stop.
Okay. Run out of time, I'm afraid. Ali Kaderi and Karen von Hippel, thank you very much indeed to both of you.
Donald Trump watched his words tonight like a man who finally understood just how much trouble they could cause. It was on the flight to Mar-a-Lago, Florida, ahead of a meeting with his Chinese counterpart, that he skimmed the curtain divide to talk to the press corps and tell them, with as much diplomacy as he has perhaps ever mustered, that something must happen with Syria's President Assad. We don't know what. We'll come to China diplomacy and why it matters in a moment. But first, to that more pressing question in hand. As the United Nations in New York works to find a resolution to condemn the chemical gas attack this week at the hands of Assad, the US Secretary of State has said he's looking for a serious response. Our correspondent Nick Bryant is at the United Nations for us. Nick, just interpret what you were hearing from the Pentagon, from America tonight, and whether you think it includes options for military action.
When they talk about a serious response, I think increasingly it looks certain that that will be a military response. Now, General James Mattis, who is the US Defense Secretary, was already going to be in Florida, but now we understand that he will be presenting President Trump, the Commander-in-Chief, with various military options, one of which includes grounding Syrian aircraft. And there is a lot of chatter of the possibility not just of a military strike, but an imminent military strike, possibly as soon as tonight, which would be aimed at the airbase in Syria from which America believes the planes took off carrying that chemical arsenal in Idlib province. An awful lot of chatter tonight in Pentagon that the response will be military and that military response is imminent.
What is the rush in your understanding, Nick? Do you think that he expects the UN resolution to fail, or is he quite simply trying to beat the UN to it? How do you read it?
I think the Americans are expecting the negotiations here at the United Nations to fail. I've just received a text actually from somebody who was in those negotiations, and their full expectation is that the Russians will veto the resolution that has been under discussion. Now, the French and the British actually drafted the initial resolutions, then the Americans came in with much stronger language. They wanted access for international investigators to the air bases that they believe these attacks might have been carried out from, and they also wanted the Syrian military to hand over the flight logs on the day of the attack, on Tuesday. Now, I expect the Americans will bring that to a vote in the next hour or two, and the Russians will raise their hand for the 8th time to veto a resolution directed against the Assad regime. Now, Nikki Haley, America's new UN ambassador, said yesterday that if there was Russian obstructionism, if there was Russian intransigence to the United Nations, then the Americans would take action. So you could see a possible choreography here, a vote in the Security Council, the Russians veto the resolution which the Western nations have been calling for, and then the possibility of some kind of military action later on.
Nick, it's fascinating, thank you, and complicated. Let's go to James Carafano, who's the Homeland Security and Foreign Policy expert from the Heritage Foundation, who might be able to cast a little bit of light, sir, on what we're hearing in the last few moments. Have you understood that any kind of military strike by the United States is imminent? What do you make of that?
Well, I've heard the same chatter everybody else has. It fits in the notion of a narrowly targeted punitive strike as kind of saying this is beyond the pale, and so that certainly seems possible. I mean, this is not something that I think would be part of a larger strategy dealing with regime change or anything else. It would simply be kind of a warning shot against that this kind of behavior is beyond the pale. You know what it reminds me of most? It seems an awful lot like some of Reagan's punitive strikes that he did early in his tenure to kind of send people messages. And I think that seems to be the closest analogy of what we're expecting.
But this would be Donald Trump setting himself not just against Bashar al-Assad, but also against Putin, who is expected to veto any UN resolution tonight. That would be the first time those two were set against each other so far.
Well, see, no, I think people completely miss the point of that. People continue to believe that somehow Trump is trying to get along with Putin, and we've seen no real evidence of that other than tweets and comments and stuff down the road. I mean, I think literally the president would have to stick a pin in a Putin doll every day to get people over the notion that somehow the U.S. position is to be accommodating to the Russians. I don't think that the president's batting an eyelash about this. The challenges are, one is you don't want to do something that's potentially escalatory, because nobody wants to start World War III over this. And it is a diversion. It would have to be a limited strike. And I think the argument for sooner rather than later is the more it drags on, the more people will chatter about it, the more it bogs down in the politics involved. If you're going to do it and get it over with.
But if it's a limited strike, and yet we've heard Donald Trump trying to explain to the press corps on that flight tonight that he thinks something should happen to Assad, would it be limited but effective in terms of stopping Assad from going on, or not that far?
Well, I think it would be proportional. So if you were attacking the military facilities or installations or assets that conducted the chemical strike, you could argue, well, that's a proportional response. I think so. When I think he calls out Assad by name, I don't think it's necessarily I'm going to go out and try to take down the regime. I think people read way too much into that.
James Carafano, thank you, sir. Stay with us, because we're going to China. Watch the handshake, the body language, the words tonight. This is perhaps as good as it gets for diplomacy nerds. China meets America, Xi Jinping meets Trump, and the world's waiting to see who emerges on top. Perhaps they're not quite as different as they seem. Nationalists, both businessmen who both recognise the art of the deal. Whether they both end up with one is the stuff of the next fascinating 24 hours. Trump fans will still remember what he said about China on the campaign trail. The question is, does China too? And will it bear a grudge?
Look beyond the sun-kissed setting and you'll find a minefield. This is one of those encounters that matters. The big beasts get to stamp their ground in the same room to the gaze of the world press. And this is where we really start to see who has the upper hand, Xi Jinping or the man who airs his diplomatic grievances on a chat show.
The president of China is coming, a man named Xi Jinping. Do you know Xi Jinping? I never heard of him. I don't know who he is. If you were president, would you throw him a big dinner?
I'd get him a McDonald's hamburger and I'd say, we got to get down to work.
On the campaign trail, Trump never shied away from colourful language.
We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing.
Jobs disappeared. And the way the economy's going right now, it's tough to find a job.
For rape, you might wish to read trade. It's the thing that keeps his trade advisor, Peter Navarro, up at night, a man who once made a whole documentary on the subject he called Death by China. President Trump has consistently criticised the large trade deficit between their two countries, currently around $350 billion, an imbalance caused by American imports of cheap Chinese products.
I don't think it's necessarily bad that a president come in having said tough things about China. It's almost the norm in American presidential politics. When George W. Bush, who I worked for, said in the first months of his presidency he would rise up and defend Taiwan if it's attacked, which goes beyond the U.S. position up to that point. And over the next 8 years, he had a very productive relationship with his Chinese counterparts.
But there's also that small matter of nuclear warfare. Last week, Trump told the Financial Times that if China were unwilling to solve North Korea, he'd go it alone. The US is looking to China to implement sanctions against North Korea as punishment for its recent bout of missile testing. The meeting of these superpowers, visualised so powerfully by the 1972 union of Mao and Nixon, who normalised relations after a 25-year freeze, has become a thing of global significance.
They expected that he and the other deputy premier, Fang Yi, should wear the Texan hat.
Deng Xiaoping, magnificently incongruous at a Texas rodeo, paved the way for the next China trip, Reagan, in 1984, when the full force of China's economic might was becoming too big to ignore. And by the time Obama met his counterpart, the pivot to Asia seemed complete.
The United States is a Pacific nation, and we are very interested and very focused on continuing to strengthen our relationships.
China, huge China.
Some believe for all the easily satirised bellicose banter famously sent up, you'll remember, on Saturday Night Live, his team's actually woefully underprepared. There is no major China policy in place, few old China hands in his administration.
He hasn't got a China strategy in place yet. And that is why I think the Chinese government decided that it's worth their while to take the risk on President Trump and try to see whether they could persuade President Trump to approach relationship with China more in a direction that the Chinese government would like.
Trump needs to emerge from this with the promises of wins on trade and American jobs. He may well get that. But the Chinese may be looking for something that's far more significant longer term. Confirmation of the reach of their power within the Asian neighbourhood. If Trump walks into simple linguistic traps, many fear the sophisticated Xi will leave. The end result may look far more compromising, and it will matter to us all. Well, our China editor, Carrie Gracie, joins us now. Carrie, how important is this encounter, first of all, for Xi, and what does success look like for the Chinese right now?
It's enormously important to Xi Jinping. He's got a Communist Party Congress coming up at the end of this year. If he can bring home a victory, or something he can call a victory, from the biggest foreign policy stage, then that enormously strengthens him at home. And they see this as a moment of danger, yes, a moment of risk to head into Florida without an agenda, with this unpredictable counterpart. But on the other hand, it is also a moment of opportunity. The US has no China strategy right now. As you were saying a moment ago, it has no China team. And you know, President Obama had a China strategy. There was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the big trade deal for Asia, underpinned by security alliances. Without TPP, which President Trump has now walked away from, the whole of Asia is looking on and saying, what is the US policy in Asia. And this is a moment for China to step in while policy is unformed and to help President Trump form it in a way that suits President Xi. So I think for them, they see a lot that they can do. And if they can just deliver enough on trade to avert trade war, if they can deliver enough to avoid serious secondary sanctions against Chinese firms or North Korea, then they can get the mood music right and go home and call it a triumph.
Carrie, thanks very much indeed. Well, James Carafano, you met a moment ago from the Heritage Foundation, conservative think tank, is still with us. And here in the studio with me, author and Chinese activist Diane Wei-Ling and Martin Jacks, an academic and author of When China Rules the World. It's very nice to have you all here. What do you believe is at stake? Martin?
Well, I think an enormous amount is at stake because, from the Chinese point of view, this is the first time since Deng Xiaoping that they faced a new situation of this kind, where they've got a president in America who is on a very different course to all the previous presidents.
Well, why do you say that? I mean, why do you say since Deng Xiaoping? Because actually, a lot of them have gone in with this sort of saber-rattling approach, haven't they?
Yes, but they haven't, like Trump, rejected the whole idea of the kind of alliance system of the United States since 1945 and said, you know, walk away from global leadership, what we want is America first. That's very different from many of the other positions. Now, what we don't know, of course, is how far Trump is going to go along this course. We know he's had a lot of rhetoric about it, but we don't know how much he's actually going to do.
James, I'm going to just bring you in on that one point. Do you think we're going to hear the same rhetoric again from Trump? Do you think it still works in the close proximity, one-on-one?
No, I think, you know, I think Xi's actually well matched for Trump. He can be very serious and engaging, and I actually think they might have a fairly productive discussion if they kind of keep it at the business level. So I actually think, I think Eder's right on trade. They may actually be able to come out of the room and both feel like they can offer something. But North Korea, because of the news, that's going to be a top thing, and the U.S. is going to come in with a tough series of demands, and they're going to demand that China do things, and they may frame it stuff, we're going to give you 30 days to do this, and if you don't do that, we're going to do it. But it will include kind of sanctioning Chinese companies, and that's absolutely on the table for the United States, and I think the administration is absolutely seriously about that threat.
Diane, the perception is that she is incredibly well prepared for this, very sophisticated in the kind of landmines, traps that he can set for President Trump. What do you think he will be hoping for?
Well, President Xi, I have to say, he's coming in a very strong position. I actually have to disagree with Carrie on this one, that he is into the middle of his tenure. And he's in a very strong position, even though he has the People's Congress coming up. That's normally a rubber stamping. He has enormous support within China. And the Chinese government has been used to American presidents coming in and having a dip in the relationship. And with every president, U.S. president, China-U.S. relationship had always deteriorated within the first 6 months.
It didn't go well with Obama. You know, he was the pacifist. He was facing the Pacific Ring, and it didn't really work. Do you think they quite admire Trump's strongman?
Well, what they see Trump is a deal maker, and they still believe he is a deal maker. Only now they're suspecting that he might be a one-trick pony, which is to talk tough and come in, try to get a good negotiation position. And for China, I think on trade, there is definitely likes to remove, room to maneuver. On North Korea, there's also room to maneuver. They could offer cooperation. Right. China is not ally of North Korea. China just does not want a military action and that tens of thousands of refugees at its border.
Do you agree with that?
Can I strike a slightly optimistic note? And that is that if Xi and Trump can get through this summit on reasonable terms, with a reasonable exchange, getting on with reasonable chemistry, and, you know, on one or two things they reach some kind of agreement, concession here, gain there, and so on. And then it's not inconceivable that down the road they couldn't actually strike a much bigger bargain. a much bigger global agreement. I think that it's not impossible. I know it sounds...
You mean a different NAFTA or a different TPP? You mean in terms of a trade deal?
Yeah, well, I mean something which is... there are things that China could do for the United States.
What?
For example, they could open up China to more exports and investment in new areas, in new sectors for the United States. They could invest serious money in American infrastructure, either via the AIB or in some direct form.
So China rebuilding America, China making America great again?
Yeah, I mean, China could play a role in this.
I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Think that's, no, I think that's just a bit Pollyannish. I mean, I do agree that they could actually both come out of it looking strong, or they could both come out and accomplish nothing. But I do think that this leading to some kind of grand bargain, I just do think that's extremely unrealistic. There are major strategic issues on the table that common ground is not going to be easy. South China Sea, Taiwan. So I think that is a bit Pollyannish. But can we learn to get along? I think yeah. This could be a start of that. I do agree. We might come out here well.
Learn to get along.
No, let's not.
Until Trump supporters realise that all the jobs that he said had gone to China haven't really gone to China. They've gone to automation.
Well, but it doesn't matter. As long as Trump's creating jobs, he's going to get reelected. They don't really care how those jobs get created. That's his challenge.
Well, I don't see Trump getting into a trade agreement, and this is one thing that he doesn't believe in trade agreement. But I can see the bilateral relationship between China and U.S.
But can you see China opening up to more American investment? Can you see China wanting to rebuild the railways in America?
Well, China does want to invest in America, but opening up China's market, it can be tricky. It depends on how much you're talking about, because if China opens up to America, China's got to open up to Europe, to everything.
Right. And they've been trying that for the last 3 decades.
Absolutely. And that is very crucial to the Chinese.
The Chinese have actually invested $42 billion, big increase in America this year. And they've just invested in carriages and, if I remember correctly, the LA subway system. So, these are private Chinese firms by and large, so certain things are in motion already.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks for joining us.